Force over here, and welcome back to another reading live stream. Tonight, even though I know it's like almost, it's about like 2 o'clock in the morning, right? I guess. Yep. Eh, almost 2 o'clock in the morning. Um, we're still doing this because I am honestly in the mood to do this. Primarily because yesterday, I probably should have done this yesterday, but didn't cross my mind until now. Yesterday marked 80 years since the bombing of Hiroshima. And so we are already on the chapter of the unit that involves World War One, and then immediately after that we have World War Two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read both units for this part, and then we'll probably read another two units for the next part of this reading reading of this book. Either way, I hope you guys are ready to learn about the history because we're about to delve into the part of history where, well, let's just say gets crazy. Let's just say things just go absolutely batch crazy for almost in this situation for almost 50 years. About 40 years actually, I think. Now that I think about it, 30, 40 years. Yeah. Either way, let's begin. Unit 7, Modern America and the Great War, 1900s to 1930s. Fun fact, that is what they called World War One. They just called it the Great War. Of course, after World War Two, they called it World War One, but back in the day, it was primarily called the Great War. It's impossible to separate American history from world history. George Washington instructed politicians to avoid foreign entanglements, and they did for a while. The beginning of the 20th century put an end to that. It was hard to hide on the other side of an ocean. The U.S. affected and was affected by the rest of the world. Chapter 32. Oh, yeah, let me get some of this. Chapter 32. The Great War. When World War One, initially called the Great War, erupted across multiple European nations and swept up their colonial holdings in the fighting as well, many Americans argued that it was not any of their business. For a time, that was true. The causes of the war had little to do with the United States, but the United States was forever changed by this war. European empires ready for war. As competition for resources and land increased in Europe and around the world, European powers undertook militarism. Building a standing army and spending money on new war technology led to an arms race. Many European countries were also forging alliances, basically picking teams and promising that when one country went to war, their allies would come to their defense. This policy of militarism and these alliances were meant to protect the interests of the European powers who had built empires around the world. Other countries, jealous of these powerful empires, imperial holdings, wanted a bigger share of the world pie, and imperialism spread, especially into Africa. At the same time, there was a rise in nationalism across Europe among groups who were subjects of these same powerful enemies. Powerful empires, I should say. My mistake. These people, proud of their distinct cultures and languages, craved independence. Bosnia wanted to break away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austro-Hungary. The Irish in the British Empire, the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, now modern-day Turkey, and the Polish in the Russian Empire also wanted to break away from colonial rule. Remember the main reasons for World War I using this mnemonic device: militaries, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. These tensions made peace in Europe so fragile that anything could have set off conflict. It was a powder keg ready to explode. The spark. Millions of Slavic people who lived under the Austro-Hungarian Empire wanted to become part of Serbia. On June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo. A month later, on July 28, 1914, Austria declared war on Serbia. Within weeks, nations had taken their sides, and within months, the shape of the war was determined. By early August 1914, a full-scale war had developed in Europe. These lists show the two sides, and the number of estimated deaths from each country. From the Central Powers, we have Austria-Hungary, who had 2 million deaths. Germany, 2.7 million. The Ottoman Empire, 3 million. Bulgaria, 400,000. The Allied Powers, or the Allies. Their numbers were, from Serbia, 750,000. Russian Empire, 3.3 million. France, 2 million. The British Empire, 1.5 million. Italy, 1 million. Romania, 600,000. Estimates for the total number of people who died during the war ranged from 16 million to 35 million. Historians estimate that almost half of the deaths were civilian. Many other countries suffered war deaths as well, but no other countries suffered to the degree that these first groups did. The United States, after joining the war later in 1917, lost about 117,000 people. And there is even a color code on this map that shows you each ally, like which side each country was in, as seen here on that map. A modern and deadly war. Modern weapons caused far more casualties at a faster rate than ever before. New weapons included machine guns, poison gas, submarines, armored tanks, and airplanes. Pilots who shot down lots of enemy planes were called aces. The most famous German ace was Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron. The most famous American ace was Eddie Rickenbacker. The armies used a new style of fighting called trench warfare. Soldiers stayed in dugout trenches for long stretches of time with a no man's land between them. The soldiers would sometimes fire at one another, but there were few gains for either side, causing a 4-year stalemate. A situation in which nothing could be done or won by either side, also called an impasse. Yeah, and the very top of that page shows you what trench warfare basically is. So you have the two sides, and you have these trenches. And basically, each side is trying to gain that land. Even little by little, they're trying to gain the land that is in the middle of the trenches, which is called no man's land. And the reason why they call it that is because more often than not, the men running across like areas like right here and right here could get shot down and killed because of what they're doing. With no working farms or factories, starvation was another big problem. In addition, successful blockades of food supplies prevented food imports from getting to needy countries. And an unusual flu, identified first in Spain, caused a pandemic in 1918 that killed more people than died in combat. Pandemic. An epidemic or widespread disease that affects an entire country or continent, or even the entire world. We have gone through this more recently with COVID-19, even though some people, for whatever reason, like to keep calling it a hoax. As much as 5% of the world's population died from a disease that easily mutated and traveled around the world with the movement of troops. The U.S. gets off the fence. President Wilson and the American people were reluctant to get involved in this deadly war. In fact, Wilson won re-election in 1916 using the slogan, "He kept us out of war." So, what made the United States finally get involved? Well, U.S. industries traded with both sides during the war, but Britain's blockade of Germany meant more trade with the Allied forces. U.S. banks made huge loans to the Allies and needed to make sure the Allies won if they wanted those loans paid back. The Germans retaliated against the British blockade by targeting Allied ships with submarines called Unterseeboots or U-boats. On May 7, 1915, a U-boat sank the British ship Lusitania, killing 1,000 people, including over 100 Americans. Ammunition and unlawful goods were stored in the cargo, but the Lusitania was a passenger ship, and the civilian deaths seemed inhumane. Anti-German sentiment rose in the U.S., but Wilson was determined to remain neutral. Wilson also wanted a seat at the negotiation table after the war. He persuaded Germany to promise not to target passenger ships. This became a pattern. Germany would sink a ship, the U.S. would chastise Germany, and Germany would pledge to stop. Gee, I wonder if that happens in the build-up to the next World War. However, in January 1918, Germany announced that it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare. A month later, British intelligence intercepted a telegram from a German official named Arthur Zimmermann. The Zimmermann note proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico against the U.S. Mexico declined the invitation, but the telegram was published by American newspapers, and anti-German sentiment boiled over. In March 1917, a month after the Zimmermann note was made public, the Russian Revolution began. Tsar Nicholas II, forced to step down, was replaced by a democratic government. This meant the U.S. could join the war without siding with an oppressive monarchy. Within a year, a political group called the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, seized power in Russia and set up a communist government promising land, peace, bread to the people while making peace with Germany. Historians argue that President Wilson was an idealist and really wanted to participate in the treaty negotiations at the end of the war. The only way to get a seat at that table was to take part in the war itself. On April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war. After 3 months of debate, the U.S. entered the fight. Also, communism, an economic system where the government owns the means of production and distributes resources equitably. War preparations. To prepare for war, the federal government had to mobilize an army, reorganize industries to manufacture war supplies, rally public support, and silence dissent. Even with a large number of volunteers, including women and black people, the U.S. military was too small to handle such a big war. In May 1917, the Selective Service Act started a draft for all men between the ages of 21 and 30. Black soldiers were segregated from white soldiers in the American forces, but fought shoulder to shoulder with French soldiers. Some of these black Americans were awarded the French Croix de Guerre, or the Cross of War, medal for their bravery. The War Industries Board directed the distribution and production of war supplies. Meanwhile, the Committee on Public Information created propaganda about German atrocities to promote anti-German feelings. It worked, but generated harassment of German Americans. That's it. That's, again, a running gag with our country for whatever reason. Every time we deal with, we fight a country that is considered the enemy, in this case the Germans, we, for whatever reason, harass people that also happen to have German ancestry. Or at the very least, they, as some people may put it, look German, act German, speak German, or like, or have a German accent. They still would treat them like they still would be, well, an asshole to them. We have a knack of, well, not all of us, but a number of us have a knack of doing that. And to be quite perfectly honest, that's bullshit. Don't hate on a person just because they share the blood of a current enemy. I think there's this episode called The Drumhead. Very good episode. I highly recommend it. If you guys ever, if anybody here has not seen Star Trek, or you have watched Star Trek, just not that episode, to understand what I'm saying, that episode would be the best thing going for you to watch to get what I'm saying. Rallying public support. The CPI also played a major role in getting the public to buy war bonds, which was like making a loan to the government to be paid back with interest after the war. Save resources like food and fuel through voluntary programs. When you pledged to do this, the Fuel Administration and the Food Administration gave you posters to put in your windows as proof of your patriotism. Planned victory gardens so that a higher percentage of the food from larger farms could go to soldiers. Silencing dissent. Though most Americans supported the war effort once war was declared, there were still many who opposed the war. The government responded by passing two new laws. The Espionage Act, which created penalties for spying, and the Sedition Act, which made it illegal to express negative opinions about the government or interfere with the war effort. As a result, many pacifists who opposed war together and socialists who thought that the everyday people were paying the price to protect American business interests were jailed. In the 1919 Supreme Court case Schenck versus the United States, the court ruled that those limitations on free speech were valid in a time of war. In my opinion, no, it isn't. And this would not be the only time when people would voice their opinion about being against war. We would have two wars that I know of in particular, easily, that most, if not all that most, if not some, when it comes to smaller degree, or all of them to a bigger degree, did not support. But we'll get to those when we get to those. U.S. engagement turns the tide. The U.S. immediately helped the Allies by introducing the convoy system, a group traveling together, often for safety, sending cargo ships across the Atlantic accompanied by warships to protect them from U-boat attacks. The U.S. Army was small, but our Navy was not. When the American Army, called the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, led by General John Pershing, arrived in France, it provided an influx of energy to the Allies. The introduction of manpower boosted morale and shifted the momentum of the war. Many believe that the AEF soldiers were called doughboys because the buttons on their uniforms looked like dough. President Wilson proposed the 14 points, a plan to avoid another world war. Among other things, this plan argued that no country should maintain an oversized military, negotiate secret alliances/treaties, claim new imperial colonies, interfere with ocean travel and trade, proposed the boundaries and borders of the participating countries could be renegotiated and adjusted fairly, suggested that the populations seeking independence from the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire be granted autonomy or self-government. Insisted that a League of Nations, an organization of countries working together to resolve disputes, be established. By 1918, the Central Powers were falling apart. Germany had underestimated the U.S. forces, and their navy was close to mutiny. At the same time, the deadly 1918 influenza pandemic was taking over the globe and devastating military camps and hospitals on all sides. Germany agreed to an armistice, and a ceasefire went into effect at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918. The Great War was over. The Treaty of Versailles. In 1919, the Big Four, President Wilson, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of England, Premier Georges Clemenceau of France, and Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando of Italy, met at Versailles near Paris. No Central Powers were invited. Wilson wanted to end the war with minimal animosity, but the victorious European nations wanted Germany to take full blame, lose its colonies, lose its military, and pay reparations, or financial compensation paid to someone who has been wronged. The Treaty of Versailles addressed some of Wilson's 14 points. It redrew boundaries in Europe and split up the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, but this failed to solve ethnic divisions and maybe even made them worse. Germany was punished so harshly that recovery from the war was all but impossible. Wilson campaigned for this Treaty of Versailles, but Congress rejected it. They worried that the League of Nations would rob Congress of power by deciding when and where the American military would fight. Wilson's greatest ambition was realized when the League of Nations was established, but the U.S. never joined. A glimpse of the future. American society was changed by this war. With so many young men drafted into the army, women, immigrants, and black people had access to better jobs than ever before. Labor agents from the North even came south with railroad tickets in hand to entice black laborers to move north, causing massive migration within the country. After the war, Americans wanted to return to isolationism. The Senate, which must approve treaties negotiated by the President, rejected the Treaty of Versailles and never entered the League of Nations. Despite this, it was clear that the United States had taken its place on the world stage. To engage in world trade, the country had to engage in the world. This thing right here, I noticed it, and it's kind of bugging me. Alright. Chapter 33. The Roaring Twenties. Back to normal. Or not. World War I and the influenza pandemic challenged Americans' sense of certainty and stability and proved disruptive to traditions both abroad and at home. Many wanted what presidential candidate Warren G. Harding coined in 1920 as a return to normalcy. Though Harding won the presidential contest, there was no chance the U.S. could step back in time. Over the decade, Americans tried to shake off the war with high spirits and consumer spending, but there were deep underlying problems. Problem 1, the economy. When soldiers returned home, the government didn't need extra workers to make supplies for them anymore. This led to high unemployment. Problem 2, labor. Wages and prices had been kept down during the war. After the war, prices went up, but not wages. Leading the strikes. Women, immigrants, and black people who had access to jobs during the war were often pushed out of those jobs to favor the soldiers returning from the war. Problem 3. Nativism and racism. With the lack of jobs, racism and anti-immigrant feelings increased. You know the old saying, "They're taking our jobs!" And every time someone says that, what jobs are yours? How are they taking the jobs when they weren't yours to begin with? They're giving these jobs to people that they feel. Now, some people could say, well, people are taking them for a lower pay rate. They're hiring people for a lower pay rate compared to hiring white people. Okay, now, putting that in consideration, do you know how many people I've seen that, you know how many, like, in my workplace alone, I could count many people who were white skinned compared to non white people in there. Regardless if it's a man or a woman. So to say that people of color or immigrants are taking our jobs, no, they're not. You're just trying to find some bullshit excuse to justify your bullshit behavior against people who don't look and act exactly like you. So that's why whenever somebody says something like that, I'll be like, okay, okay, do you do that job? And if they say, is that your job? No. Then why are you complaining? Hmm? Because your job, that job does not have your name on it. That job goes to the person that the business believes is suitable for that position. Simple. It's that simple, but yet people gotta have a problem with it. They gotta have a problem that even one non-white person could have a job, and that's automatically they're taking jobs. That's not how that works. Be quiet. The Red Scare. Americans were afraid the communist takeover in Russia would repeat itself in the U.S. and put an end to capitalism on an economic and political system where industry is controlled for profit. This led to the Red Scare, a fear of communists, called Reds, and other radicals. When bombings took place across the country, communists were blamed, and Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer led the Palmer raids. No major discoveries were ever made on suspected communists, socialists, and anarchists, often without warrants. Labor unions were deemed communist organizations, and when workers began to strike, violent government intervention was seen as justified. Okay, I'm going to say this. In a way, this is in some ways similar to the Salem witch trials. Here's why I say this. I had this thought in my head for some time now, and I was thinking about something like this, and then like some other stuff. This in my book sounds exactly like the modern day equivalent, I guess you could say modern day equivalent of the Salem witch trials, because in Salem, Massachusetts, for those of you that don't remember me reading about that, in Salem, Massachusetts, there were people that were, for one reason or another, who were accused of being involved in witchcraft or wizardry. Either way, they were accused of doing that, and 9 out of 10 chances are they would be executed. They'd be found guilty and executed because of that. Here, we're having a similar situation. How people were blamed, and they led Palmer raids on suspected communists, socialists, and anarchists, often without warrants. And we're about to read something here that also in a way, proves my point as to what I'm talking about here. Also, socialism, an economic system in which property and the means of production are regulated by the state and equally distributed among citizens. Now, what I'm about to say puts what I just said, that in my book, the Red Scare is exactly, in its own way, similar to the Salem witch trials, is also founded in this next paragraph I'm about to read. The trial and execution of Nicolas Sarto and Bartolomeo Svanzetti suggested that the Red Scare had a nativist foundation. The two Italian-born born anarchists were sentenced to death for killing 2 men during the robbery. They probably didn't get a fair trial. No, it really says that in the book. They probably didn't get a fair trial. I'm not making that up. Harding's Republicanism and Teapot Dome. President Harding, a former Republican senator from Ohio, was a strong believer in small government. As president, he instituted high tariffs and income tax reductions, especially for the wealthy. Harding appointed his friends from Ohio, many of whom were unqualified and corrupt, to important government positions. I'm sorry to say, exactly like Trump in his current term. And nobody can say otherwise. Nobody absolutely cannot say otherwise. To important government positions. Harding's friend and Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, was convicted of accepting bribes from oil executives for rights to drill on government land in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, which became known as the Teapot Dome Scandal. When Harding died of a heart attack on August 2, 1923, his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, became president. Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge was seen as quiet and honest. He believed in laissez-faire economics and tried to keep the government out of the economy. He was re-elected in 1924 on the strength of his beliefs in minimal government, high tariffs, and low taxes. Well, part of that is similar to Trump. Only one of those things, to be honest. Coolidge is known for the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which made war illegal. More than 60 nations signed the agreement. But think about it. How do you enforce something that says you can't fight? That is a good question, actually. In 1924, the year Coolidge was re-elected, Nellie T. Ross of Wyoming and Miriam A. Ferguson of Texas were elected the nation's first women governors. In 1916, Jeanette Rankin of Montana had become the first woman elected to the U.S. Congress. Consumerism. Prosperity seemed to be on the rise again, and new consumer goods, often inspired by new war technology and made cheaper by new production methods, flooded the stores. The radio, previously used only by the military, is one example. Consumers could buy the things they wanted using installment plans if they didn't have the money to buy goods outright. The automobile is an example of consumerism, which refers to large amounts of money or goods sold to individual people instead of businesses. All that jazz. People had shorter work days, more leisure time, and a live-for-today attitude. Young people moved to the cities. The excitement and modernity of this time period gave it the nickname the Roaring Twenties. Radios became a part of everyday home, and radio networks made sure that Americans listened to the same programs and ads. The film industry grew. Hollywood became the center of a major industry. Talkies, as opposed to silent movies, were introduced. Americans followed the lives of celebrities from sports stars like Babe Ruth to pilots like Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart. Women were voting, were better educated, and were working mostly as nurses, teachers, secretaries, and clerks. Other new aspects of popular culture were Art Deco architecture, crossword puzzles, and dances like the Charleston. Jazz was a big part of pop culture. It was developed by black musicians in New Orleans who were influenced by music from West Africa, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and France. Jazz was so popular that this decade is also called the Jazz Age. The Harlem Renaissance. Excuse me. During World War I, many black people moved from the South to the North to work in factories in the Great Migration. Great Migration. Don't confuse with the Great Migration from England to the present-day U.S. from 1629 to 1640. They brought jazz and the blues with them to the north. The Great Migration was met with resistance, especially by the KKK, which was no longer limited to the South. Also, if I remember correctly, what would now be about 110 years ago, because it is about that year now, there was a movie known as The Birth of a Nation that was so controversial that the NAACP heavily denounced it. But from what I've heard, I don't know if it's true or not, but from what I've heard, this movie helped spark the rekindling of the Ku Klux Klan, which, for whatever reason, is still a thing today, even though, quite frankly, when it comes not the people, just the group itself should just die off. It should it should be forced to disappear. Hell, at the very least, put them on an island. If they really don't want to deal with non-white people so bad, move them on an island, so they don't have to deal with anyone but themselves. That's what I would do. To fight back, organizations like the NAACP worked to secure human civil rights. You know what? I actually just said this, actually, here. But I'll read that here in a moment, because it's part of what I said. A reformer, Marcus Garvey, founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, and advocated a large-scale return to Africa. The plans fell short, but he did encourage black nationalism and a sense of racial dignity. The KKK was virtually wiped out after the Force Acts under the Grant administration. It returned after D.W. Griffith released his film The Birth of a Nation in 1915, which portrayed the KKK as heroic. No, the fuck they're not. Black communities thrived in New York City's Harlem, a neighborhood where overdevelopment had driven down the price of real estate. Harlem became home to many black artists and gave rise to the Harlem Renaissance, an intellectual and cultural revival of black art, literature, fashion, music, and politics. Prominent names of this movement include writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, and jazz artists such as Duke Ellington. Black Americans weren't the only people fighting for their civil rights in the 1920s. The League of United Latin American Citizens, or the LULAC, was founded, and the Indian Citizenship Act was passed, granting full citizenship to indigenous Americans. Took that fucking long enough. Backlash. Rapid modernization also created a backlash, especially in rural areas. More nativism. The government set limits on the number of immigrants who could come into the U.S. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 mostly targeted Southern and Eastern European immigrants. The Immigration Act of 1924 included the Asian Exclusion Act and targeted restrictions on Asian immigrants specifically. Fundamentalism. This religious movement centered on the belief in a literal interpretation of the Bible, particularly regarding creationism, the belief that people were created by God, exactly as described in the Judeo-Christian Bible. In 1925, a teacher named John Scopes broke Tennessee law by teaching the students about evolution. During this trial, the Scopes monkey trial, William Jennings Bryan represented the prosecution, and Clarence Darrow, in the American Civil Liberties Union, defended Scopes. Scopes was originally found guilty of violating the law, but the state Supreme Court overturned the ruling on a technicality. The law itself was eventually ruled unconstitutional. However, it was not repealed until 1967. Prohibition. Prohibition, a ban on alcohol, began in 1920. It was hard to enforce because people could make their own alcohol or buy it in underground bars called speakeasies. Outlaws, known as bootleggers, also smuggled alcohol. Some worked with gangsters like Al Capone. Prohibition made organized crime worse. It was repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. The Lost Generation. Many intellectuals and creative people, including writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, grew disenchanted with the violence of World War I, consumerism, and the U.S. in general. Many lived as expatriates, someone who chooses not to live in their home country. First thing that popped in my head when I read Ernest Hemingway, there's a puppet that goes by the name of Randy Feltface, who did a skit where he basically told the life of Ernest Miller Hemingway in approximately 3.5 minutes. Chapter 34: The Great Depression. Stock Market Crash. During the boom of the 1920s, many people hoped to grow their wealth by speculating in the stock exchange, a market for shares of companies. If a company does well, the value of the stock increases, and the owner can then sell the stock for a profit. During the bull market of the 1920s, people bought stocks eagerly because their values were increasing, even though the companies were not worth any more than they had been. Some people bought stocks using borrowed money, which they hoped to pay back with a profit from their stock. People were also buying on margin, which meant they paid only 10% of the stock price initially. They hoped the price would rise quickly so they could resell for a profit. In the middle of 1929, the value of stocks reached a high point, and some people decided to sell their shares. The more stocks people sold, the fewer stocks people wanted to buy, decreasing the value of the stocks. On October 29, 1929, a day known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed to almost zero value. Many people lost all their money in a single day. During a bull market, stock prices rise or are expected to rise, so people tend to purchase stocks. During a bear market, stock prices fall or are expected to fall, so people tend to sell stocks. The Great Depression. Black Tuesday was the beginning of the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in U.S. history thus far. Many people had bought stocks on the East credit of the 1920s, but when they defaulted on their loans, banks and stockbrokers lost money too. Also to fail to pay a debt. However, the stock market crash was only one cause of the Great Depression. Other causes include the illusion of wealth that swept the country in the previous decade had led to overproduction in factories and agriculture. In reality, few people could afford to purchase the goods produced. The surplus and excess caused the prices to fall, which caused profits to fall, which led companies to lay off their workers. Because of high unemployment, even fewer people could afford the goods, causing the cycle to snowball, to grow or become larger or more intense at an accelerating rate. Anyone who deposited money into a bank account lost it if the bank went out of business. When people with savings in banks saw that loans were being defaulted on, they panicked and withdrew as much money as possible, causing a run on the banks. This put more banks out of business, making it impossible for other businesses to take out loans. Layoffs followed, and this process snowballed too. Tough economic times in other countries, a result of the Great War, reduced the market for exports. Hoover's economics. The president at the start of the Great Depression was Herbert Hoover. During the election of 1928, the Republican Party was credited with the perceived prosperity of the 1920s. So, when the Republican Party nominated Hoover, he was virtually assured of victory. Hoover was a strong believer in laissez-faire economics and small government. Hoover's stance on the Depression was that it was not the job of the federal government to take care of people. Instead, the crisis would take care of itself as part of what many thought was a normal cycle of the economy. High unemployment, 24% of Americans, or 12 million people, were unemployed. Hunger and homelessness were on the rise across the country. Children left school to work or ran away because they felt they were a burden on their parents. Families fell apart. Even when the nation pleaded with the government to act, Hoover refused. The shanty towns, a neighborhood of informal houses usually made from discarded materials, that sprang up to house people evicted from their homes, became known as Hoovervilles. Eventually, Hoover gave in. In 1931, he authorized spending on public works, such as the Boulder Dam, now the Hoover Dam, to create jobs. And in 1932, he agreed to the creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which made loans to banks and businesses. The Bonus Army. Hoover's reputation was damaged even more when, in the summer of 1932, World War I veterans who were due to receive bonus pay in 1945 marched on Washington to demand early payment. When Hoover and the Congress refused, some of the protesters stayed in a D.C. area Hooverville. Under Hoover's direction, General Douglas MacArthur led the military to drive out the Bonus Army using tanks and tear gas. Several Great War veterans were killed, and the public was shocked. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Well, first off, Hoover did what I would consider to be one of the worst things a president has ever done in history with that moment right there. That was very fucking stupid on his ass. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Hoover ran for president again in 1932, even though he knew that his chances of winning were slim. His Democratic rival, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, was a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, and he was paralyzed from the waist down from polio. Roosevelt had an excellent record of helping the people of New York, where he was governor, and a strong group of advisors known as the Brain Trust helped him with policy. His campaign promised a New Deal for Americans, and he won the election easily. The First New Deal. In his first inaugural address, FDR famously told the nation that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and he quickly set out to destroy that fear. Roosevelt became president on March 4th, 1933, and he called a special session of Congress that is known as the 100 Days. He instituted a bank holiday, closing all banks in the nation for a few days, while the Emergency Banking Relief Act was passed and reopened only the ones that were stable. He then gave the first of his many radio addresses to the nation, a fireside chat, in which he explained the new banking policy and eased fears. Beginning during the 100 Days and continuing until 1935, President Roosevelt instituted the programs that made up the First New Deal, which included the founding of these agencies. Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, which helped the unemployed. Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or AAA, which subsidized farmers for occasionally destroying their crops. This kept food supplies low and prices high. This policy was controversial as hunger remained a problem for many people, and yet food was being thrown away. Public Works Administration. Public works like building roads, schools, and infrastructure that is done by the government for the public. Or the Public Works Administration, or PWA, which sponsored public works and created jobs. Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, which was similar to the PWA but focused on conservation projects. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC, which insured bank deposits so people would not lose their money if banks failed. Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, which brought electricity to the Tennessee Valley through new dams and created jobs in the area. National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NIRA, which set labor standards such as minimum wage and a ban on child labor. Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, which regulated the stock market. The Second New Deal. In the 1934 midterm elections and then during the 1936 presidential election, the nation showed strong support for the Democratic Party, and Roosevelt who won in a landslide victory. Although some conservatives thought the New Deal was a socialist abuse of presidential power, and some liberals, notably Senator Huey Long of Louisiana, thought it didn't go far enough toward redistribution of wealth, most people needed more assistance. The Depression was still in full force. So, when the New Deal began to expire, Roosevelt instituted a second New Deal. More than the first set of programs, these initiatives attempted to generate true social change rather than simply help people get by. The new Works Progress Administration, or WPA, was much like the PWA but went further to employ artists and young people. The Revenue Act of 1935 raised taxes on the rich, and the Wagner Act made sure that labor unions had the right to fair negotiations. Perhaps most importantly, the Social Security Act of August 1935 gave birth to the modern system of welfare in America, assistance from the government usually in the form of money. People paid Social Security taxes throughout their working lives and, in return, receive payment back when they retire or if they are unable to work. The Dust Bowl. In addition to the Depression, Americans were hit with another misfortune during the 1930s. In 1931, a severe drought struck the Great Plains, which turned the area into a dust bowl that lasted more than a decade. For years, farmers had cleared lands in such a way that the natural grass lost the roots that would connect it to topsoil. When winds came through, the dry dirt, unanchored by grass, was swept into dust storms. Farmers from Oklahoma, in particular, left the area to become migrant workers in California. The Oklahoma natives living below the poverty threshold were known as the Okies. John Steinbeck's Great Depression era novel, The Grapes of Wrath, is about this experience. And it does show here on the map here where the Dust Bowl is at, and also where the workers migrated to with the arrows right there. Labor strength. In 1935, the Supreme Court struck down the NIRA, which protected laborers with minimum wage standards and a ban on child labor, as an unconstitutional restriction of commerce. Congress quickly responded by passing the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, guaranteeing certain rights to unions. The AFL remained strong, and the newly founded Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, increased its membership by welcoming women, people of color, and unskilled laborers. Unions began using sit-down strikes, which were strikes that took place within the factories. Remarkably, unions and labor organizations grew at a time when America had a surplus of labor. New Deal coalition. Another aspect of Roosevelt's presidency was his ability to attract new voters. Especially during the 1936 presidential elections, many black Americans switched over to the Democratic Party, thanks to FDR's progressive policies. It was the first time as a demographic group that they stepped away from the Party of Lincoln, from which the current Republican Party developed. Roosevelt relied on his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and a black cabinet, a group of black men, to advise him on matters affecting the black population. Unfortunately, to keep the support of the white Southern Democrats, FDR also deliberately limited universal access to some of his most important programs. Redlining made it harder for black families to use federal programs to buy houses, and domestic service jobs mostly held by black laborers, being the cook, maid, or chauffeur, for example, were not eligible to participate in Social Security. Redlining. The practice of denying services to people living in certain areas, often based on race. At the same time, Eleanor Roosevelt rose to prominence in national life and became a sign of the advancement of women's rights. FDR appointed the first woman cabinet member, Frances Perkins, as Secretary of Labor. Eleanor Roosevelt was a controversial First Lady and an American politician, diplomat, and activist in her own right. She was outspoken and active in fighting for the rights of women Black and Asian Americans, and war refugees. She famously arranged a concert by the black singer Marian Anderson at the Lincoln Memorial after the Daughters of the American Revolution banned her from singing at Constitution Hall. Wow, that's crazy. Escapism. Although some art that emerged during the Great Depression took a serious look at American life, like The Grapes of Wrath and Woody Guthrie's folk music, the 1930s were also the height of escapism. People watched movies and listened to music and radio to get away from daily life. Soap operas, radio dramas, big band and swing music, and movies such as The Wizard of Oz, King Kong, and Gone with the Wind helped many Americans make it through the decade. Escapism, escaping from daily life, usually through entertainment. The end of the Depression. In 1937, it seemed as though the New Deal was working. Roosevelt decided that it was time to cut the deficit, the amount by which more money is spent than is coming in, which had grown during the Depression. However, to do so, he needed to decrease spending on recovery programs. And when he did this, he miscalculated the stability of the economy. Roosevelt's decision to decrease spending, combined with limiting loans, led to another dip in the nation's economy, known as the Roosevelt Recession. Full recovery did not occur until World War II began. Most of the New Deal programs expired or were canceled as the economy improved, but some of them, such as Social Security, the FDIC, and the SEC, remain central aspects of the relationship between American citizens and the federal government. You know, some of the things that a certain dumbass in the White House has threatened to cut spending on or some shit, which in my book is bullshit, because people like myself, see, I'm legally disabled in my home state, where I live at right now, which I live in right now. I'm legally declared disabled. So if anything were to happen to me involving my workplace, like if I were let go or it were to close down at some point or anything like that, I would be out of a job and I would need Social Security to hold me over until I'm able to find another job. But he don't give a shit. He never did. And nobody can tell me he does. Nobody can tell me otherwise. Let alone try to prove it for that matter. Oh, what happened here? Okay, oh, alright. Give me 1 second, I'm gonna, plug in my controller. Yeah, and I know I keep making these comparisons with, Donald Trump in the White House right now. But it's honestly hard not to. Because I swear, some of the things I'm reading, he's the first person that comes to mind with some of the things I've been reading in this book. But anyway, moving on. Unit 8, World War II, 1930s to 1945. The world was fragile after the events of World War I, the 1918 pandemic, and the Great Depression. Once again, tensions were growing. Land and resources were in high demand, and countries were forming alliances with each other. Xenophobia was on the rise, and across the world, powerful nations were blaming their problems on innocent groups of people. World War II was officially fought on two fronts, continental Europe and the Pacific. And for many American citizens, the U.S. home front was also a war zone. We'll get to that when we get to that. Chapter 35. World War II begins. Totalitarianism. After World War I, poverty, instability, and dissatisfaction in Europe led to the rise of totalitarianism, or totalitarian dictators, who promised they could create change if only they had complete control of everything. Totalitarianism, a system in which the government acts as absolute ruler with complete control over every element of life. Totalitarian leaders did bring stability to their countries at the cost of individual liberty. In Italy had been one of the big four nations to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, but economic failure led to chaos. In 1922, Benito Mussolini, the leader of a fascist totalitarian movement, forced the King of Italy to grant him power. Fascism, a form of totalitarianism that emphasizes nationalism and conformity. He named himself dictator under the title Il Duce, the leader. The USSR formed in 1922 when the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, the RSFSR, united with three smaller Soviet republics. In the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR or Soviet Union, after the death of Lenin in 1924, Joseph Stalin took control. He began to exterminate, put to death, any countryman whom he thought might challenge his power. That sounds, while not exactly exterminating anybody, that sounds a bit similar to Vladimir Putin with with the last election that he was involved in, where he jailed his political opponent. Yeah, you can see a big problem with that. In Germany, the debt from reparation payments for World War I and from having to shut down the military and had pretty much brought about an economic collapse and destroyed the nation. Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, from the German word National Sozialistische, won the 1932 German elections, and Hitler was appointed Chancellor. He promoted the idea of Aryan, of Northern European heritage, non-Jewish superiority, and blamed the economic and social problems plaguing Germany on the Jewish population. Hitler named himself Führer and took control. Führer, German for leader. Meanwhile in Japan, Hideki Tojo, a military leader, was elected prime minister in 1941. Tojo became a dictator and soon had more influence than the Emperor of Japan. Totalitarian expansionism. Each totalitarian leader believed that his country was superior to all others and had the right to conquer. Japan invaded China, starting with Manchuria. Then in 1937, Japan invaded Nanjing, and perpetrated the Nanjing Massacre, a violent attack on the city and its people. Italy left the League of Nations and conquered Ethiopia in 1935. In 1939, Italy conquered Albania. Hold on, my TV's doing this thing. Germany annexed the Rhineland, a coal-rich area that the Treaty of Versailles had declared a neutral buffer zone in 1936. In 1930, oh yeah, by the way, buffer zone, an area that has the purpose of keeping two or more areas distant from one another. In 1938, Germany conquered Austria. Appeasement at Munich. Germany's next target was the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with a large German population. Czechoslovakia turned to France and England for help. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain proposed that Hitler could have the Sudetenland if he promised not to invade anywhere else. This appeasement, compromise, giving something up in order to maintain peace, was supposed to prevent another war. In March 1939, Hitler broke his promise and conquered the rest of Czechoslovakia. England and France warned that they'd defend Poland, which seemed to be Hitler's next target. The Axis. With their similar philosophies, these dictators formed alliances. In 1936, Hitler and Mussolini formed the Rome-Berlin Axis, aka the Axis, a coalition in which the leaders of Italy and Germany promised to support each other in the event of war. Japan joined the pact in 1940. Stalin didn't join the Axis, but signed a non-aggression pact with Germany. The two countries agreed not to attack each other and secretly agreed to grab the recently created Poland and divided between them. World War Round 2. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany as promised. World War II had begun. Hitler used a blitzkrieg, or lightning war, a tactic that combined speed and surprise, to conquer Poland in only a few weeks. Once again, the world would split into two warring sides. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Allied powers, Great Britain, France, France until Germany invaded, which we'll get to, the Soviet Union after Germany betrayed them, which we'll also get to, the U.S. and also Soviet Union, which were also after 1941, China, and many more countries. The Soviet Union also attacked Poland and then moved on to the Balkan Peninsula, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Albania, and Greece, and Finland. Hitler moved north, conquering Denmark and Norway in April 1940, then Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. War in Western Europe. France was the next target. Allied troops had set up along the Maginot Line at the German border, but they were forced to retreat to Dunkirk, a French town in the English Channel, where they were trapped as the Germans invaded from the north and Italy attacked from the south. On June 14, 1940, the Germans seized Paris, and France surrendered on June 22nd. Thousands of French and British soldiers at Dunkirk escaped on fishing boats and went to England, where they joined the Free French forces led by General Charles de Gaulle. It was far easier to replace military equipment than men, so it was important that they lived to fight another day. The Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1940, Hitler began an air attack on England. During the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe, Germany's Air Force, tried unsuccessfully to incapacitate the Royal Air Force, RAF, by bombing airfields and airstrips. The goal was to pave the way for an invasion of Britain. When the Luftwaffe changed tactics and bombed London on the night of August 24th, the RAF responded by bombing Berlin, the capital of Germany. The war intensified and the Battle of Britain became the Blitz. Germany postponed the invasion but continued to bomb the British cities of London, Liverpool, and Manchester every night from September 1940 until May 1941. I apologize for making that big mistake on saying the countries. Britain, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, refused to surrender. Ultimately, Germany retreated. A lot of children were evacuated from London during the bombings. This event even appears in the Chronicles of Narnia books. The main characters are sent away to live in the English countryside. Primarily, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That I remember for sure. Hitler decided to change direction. Needing the resources and manpower of the Soviet Union, but worried about competition from Stalin, he decided to attack Russia in June 1941, breaking the pact the two countries had formed. The Soviets were forced to retreat, losing thousands of troops who were captured or killed. Stalin changed course as well. He joined the Allies and ordered his people to destroy their own resources and burn their own cities before the Germans could get them. This is the scorched earth tactic. After Germany's betrayal, Stalin accepted the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Chapter 36. The U.S. Home Front. The other key turning point of 1941 came when the United States finally declared war on the Axis powers. Just as in World War I, the American public was reluctant to get involved, but again, the nation was provoked into engaging in the conflict. Isolationism versus reality. The U.S. tried to stay neutral. Between 1935 and 1937, Congress passed the Neutrality Acts, making it illegal for Americans to sell weapons or loan money to foreign nations. When FDR was elected for a third term, the first time any president had served more than twice in 1940, he knew, based on intelligence reports and communication with Prime Minister Churchill, the nation was on the brink of war. Congress had expanded the American military at FDR's request, and in 1940 it passed the Selective Training and Service Act, the first peacetime draft in American history. In March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act made it legal to sell or lend weapons and supplies to the Allies. That August, after Germany attacks on American destroyers, FDR and Churchill issued the Atlantic Charter. It said that neither country had any territorial ambitions in the war and that all people had the right to determine and live under a government of their own choosing. The Atlantic Charter was a little hypocritical, given that the British Empire was so large that the sun never set on the British. Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, Hideki Tojo, the Prime Minister in control of Japan, set his sights on the captured islands in the Pacific. Japan had previously launched very successful invasions of mainland Asia. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The intent was to disable the U.S. naval fleet housed there. It was a devastating attack that sank or heavily damaged 8 U.S. battleships, along with 3 cruisers and several other ships. A total of 2,403 American civilians and servicemen were killed and 1,178 were wounded. FDR, who had been inching the country away from its isolationist tendencies, seized the moment and took advantage of the universal American outrage the attack caused. The next day, he asked Congress to declare war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S., so Congress declared war back. In his call for war, FDR referred to December 7, 1941. In his call for war, FDR referred to December 7, 1941 as, quote, a day which will live in infamy, being well known for bad reasons. Mobilization on the home front. Industries produced tanks, ammunition, and other war-related products under the direction of the government. All that work ended the Great Depression, creating an employment rate of almost 100%. New government agencies formed, just like in World War I. The War Production Board decided which goods factories would produce. Americans were encouraged to ration food and grow victory gardens. Rationing, control of how much of something is available to each individual in a group. The Office of Price Administration controlled inflation. The National War Labor Board resolved labor conflicts. The Revenue Act of 1942 raised taxes. The government also raised money by selling war bonds. Opportunities and discrimination. World War II provided opportunities for women and people of color. Posters of Rosie the Riveter were used to encourage women to work in factories and the defense industry. Women enlisted in high numbers as WACs, Women's Army Corps, WAVES, women appointed for voluntary emergency service in the Navy, or as WASPs, Women's Air Force Service Pilots, but as non-combatants. Threats by black labor leader A. Philip Randolph to protest in Washington, D.C., led Roosevelt to sign Executive Order 8802, the Fair Employment Act, prohibiting racial discrimination in factories supplying the war effort. Black Americans worked in defense factories in the North. Though initially black enlistees were given only menial jobs and filled military ranks as laborers, ultimately they were allowed in combat, though in segregated units. Famous black units included the Tuskegee Airmen. Indigenous Americans fought, and they also created unbreakable secret codes based on the Navajo language. The government recruited Mexican American laborers called braceros to work in agriculture. On the flip side, women and workers of color were still paid much less than white men doing the same jobs. Greater black and Mexican American presence in cities led to tension and uprisings, including the 1943 Zoot Suit riots in L.A., named after the clothing style worn by many young Latino men at the time. After the war ended, black, Latino, and indigenous people, even those who fought in the war, still faced discrimination. Now is where the big part begins. Japanese internment in the U.S. Japanese Americans represented only about 3% of the population on the West Coast, and yet they faced severe discrimination. Japanese Americans born in Japan, Issei, were not allowed to become nationalized citizens or own land. Their children, Nisei, who were born in the United States, were citizens but still faced discrimination. Lawmakers on the West Coast already responsible for years of laws that discriminated against Japanese people took advantage of the fear and outrage that Americans felt toward Japan after the attack on Pearl Harbor to further marginalize, to set aside as unimportant, this group. They ordered the Japanese Americans to evacuate the coastal states, and most other states refused to take them in. So, FDR signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1944. This order forced more than 110,000 Americans of Japanese descent into internment camps. By legal definition, they were concentration camps that sprang up practically overnight. Entire families were relocated. Their land was seized, resold by the government, and never returned. Many people lost everything they owned. In 1944, in the case of Korematsu versus the United States, the Supreme Court upheld FDR's order as necessary, though two separate investigations revealed that Japanese Americans posed no threat. So, take a long glance what I'm about to compare this to, and again in its own way. If you said the Holocaust, yes, it's exactly like the Holocaust. With the big exception that I don't believe the Japanese Americans were put in gas chambers like the Jews were in the Holocaust, or otherwise killed in any sort of executionary style, like the gas chamber, hanging, etc., that kind of thing. And really, it boils again back down to people are just they just have this fear about people. Like with the Japanese Americans, they had this fear for them for some reason, even though a majority of them most likely had nothing to do with what happened in regard to Pearl Harbor. But again, it's because of people's fears about the Japanese that caused them to not really trust them. It's gotten to the point to where, in a more modern day stance, 9/11, for some time after that, God knows, I don't know if it, like, for some reason we still have, a number of people have this hatred toward anybody that was of the same nationality, if not also religious practice, of the perpetrators behind the 9/11 attacks. And I still follow the same sentiment I do with this, and any other time we show discrimination toward a person out of fear. Why? To me, it makes no sense. There is no, as FDR said himself, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. People fear things out of fear because of whatever quote-unquote reasons that they have. And it makes no sense. They don't like, see, people right now, not everybody, again, not everybody, some people don't like immigrants coming into this country, especially illegal immigrants, even though, as I've said before, there is a system in place that allows people who come into this country illegally to become legal citizens. But for illegal immigrants, they always fear that they're going to quote unquote take their jobs, which weren't even yours in the first place. If you're not the one working to get, if you're not trying to get that job, You got no fucking room to say that people that are not, that don't look and act exactly like you are taking your jobs when it wasn't yours to begin with. None. None. People fear the LGBTQ plus community because, well, religious people, primarily for the most part, have this fear of the LGBTQ plus community because they try to use the Bible to explain why it's unethical. Even though in reality, I'm pretty sure God would be okay with it. And it always makes me laugh how people will use the Bible to explain their hatred for the LGBTQ plus community. But in my book, the Bible is just a book that they use to hate. There is nothing in there. I bet you there is nothing in that Bible. Especially the older you go with each respective Bible, the older you go with the Bible, the more you realize that things that they say about the Bible now, that may or may not be in the Bible, probably were not in the Bible before because that wasn't really a thing for them to worry about. Gee, I wonder why. Probably because it ain't even worth worrying about in the first place. Jeez. So, and then you have these. It's just like people just have nothing but bullshit excuses to explain why they don't like a certain race or a certain group of people, just because of, like I said, their race, their ethnicity, their skin color, their sexual orientation, their gender. The list goes on and on and on. And I hate that. Here's an idea. Quit. If you're going to find something to bitch about when it comes to a person, go off on who they are as a person. Go off on on their actions, like their literal actions. What have they done recently that people should know about? Go off on that. Don't go off on anything else, especially don't go off on things that they cannot control. And no, they cannot control their sexual orientation because that is a self-discovery type of deal. That is indeed a self-discovery type of deal. And if anybody got a problem with what I just said before I read this next part about the camps, how they were, if you got a problem with that, if you want to talk about it, my comments are always open. Just as long as you talk respectfully, I got no problem discussing my thoughts to anybody. Going back to what I was reading, the camps were poorly built out of unseasoned wood. Whole families lived in 1 or 2 rooms of connected barracks. Dozens of families shared common toilet, bathing, and laundry facilities, as well as a mess hall. Japanese Americans were imprisoned by their own government. In time, the government saw that Japanese Americans were valuable in the war effort, but having justified their imprisonment by saying that the group posed a security risk, the government could not release them without admitting its mistake. Instead, a loyalty questionnaire was created to determine who could be released to rejoin American society and join the war effort. People who passed the test might be released to return to college, pick crops, or join the military and segregated forces. Some men who passed their test refused to join the army until their families had also been released from camps, and those men spent years in jail as draft resistors. People who failed in the test, whether because of confusion or anger, were kept in the camps. In 1942, the 442 Regimental Combat Team was created and composed of Japanese Americans. They served heroically during the war in Europe, but were not allowed to fight in the Pacific. Gee, I wonder why. In December 1944, Public Proclamation No. 21 lifted the executive order and declared that the camps would close and Japanese Americans were able to return to their communities. A slow resettlement process began. The last camp closed in March 1946. More than 40 years later, Congress admitted that the internment had been wrong. They made a formal apology and issued modest reparations to surviving victims and their descendants. Although something like this could never repay, could never just, this will never justify what they've done. And also on top of that, the shit that these Japanese Americans who went through this had to go through, no amount of money is going to undo what they did. None. So, in that regard, like I've always said before, it always seems like each term, with the exception of FDR's second term, his third term would probably be, like his second, if not also his third term, ended up being worse than his first. So, yeah. Also, I think I am, let's see here. Yeah, I am 2 chapters away from from finishing this part. Chapter 37. America enters the war in Europe via North Africa. Allied strategy. With the draft and volunteers, the American military was ready to fight with the Allies. But where to start? The U.S. had to fight the Axis in the Atlantic and Japan in the Pacific. Stalin wanted continental Europe to be the first target. Churchill thought the inexperienced American troops would be easily defeated and stretched too thin. He suggested that Americans head to German-occupied North Africa. In December 1941, FDR agreed to Churchill's plan, leaving Stalin to handle Europe. First, North Africa. The fighting in North Africa stretched throughout several countries. In June 1942, the German Afrika Korps, led by the Desert Fox General Erwin Rommel, pushed into Egypt. In the Battle of El Alamein, the British stopped the German advance, preventing them from capturing the strategically located Suez Canal, the British-controlled water route between the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. Another reason why Churchill wanted American troops in Africa. Later that year, General Dwight D. Eisenhower set up headquarters in Gibraltar, and in 1943 the Allies helped drive the Afrika Korps out of North Africa. Then, Italy. The Allies re-entered Europe from the south. In July 1943, they landed on Sicily, an Italian island. Led by General George S. Patton, they moved on to mainland Italy. By then, after losses in Africa and shortages in Italy, Italian leaders had overthrown Mussolini, and the new government surrendered to the Allies. Hitler didn't accept defeat. He sent more Axis troops. In January 1944, the Allies surprised German troops at Anzio, a city on the western coast of Italy, and after several months, defeated them. By June 1944, Rome was liberated. Meanwhile, back in the USSR. After their invasion of the Soviet Union in September 1942, German troops advanced to the industrial city of Stalingrad. But when winter came, the cold was so severe that much of the German army starved or froze to death. Still, Hitler refused to withdraw. In January 1943, German Commander General von Paulus defied the Führer's wishes and retreated. The Soviets suffered massive losses, but their victory was a turning point in the war because it showed Hitler's totalitarianism was weakening. The Germans tried to seize Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, but the Russians pushed them west. Just as harsh weather conditions in Russia stymied the German army, weather was a factor in the defeat of Napoleon's army in 1812. Russia had been a challenging country to conquer because of its natural safeguards. D-Day. After freeing Italy, the Allied forces were finally ready to enter German-occupied France. In June 1944, General Eisenhower, who was then the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, started Operation Overlord. Hitler expected any invasion to be near the town of Calais. Early on, June 6, 1944, which came to be known as D-Day, Allied forces landed, but not at Calais. Paratroopers, who arrived via parachutes, and amphibious troops trained to operate on both land and sea, arrived in Normandy in France. There were thousands of casualties, but the invasion was successful. American General Omar Bradley led the troops inland. On August 25th, Paris was liberated. Other Western European nations soon followed. Also, it shows here where, like, how it all went down. Right here. Battle of the Bulge. Hitler made a final attempt to turn the tide. On December 16, 1944, he attacked the Belgian region of the Ardennes. The attack forced Allied lines to move back in one spot, turning their line into a bubble shape. A bulge, which is how this attack came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. By January, the Allies had stopped the German advance. Before we continue any further, let's talk about this real quick. The Holocaust. Hitler rose to power by convincing his people that Jews were to blame for Germany's hardships. In September 1935, Germany passed the Nuremberg Laws, stripping Jews of citizenship. On November 9, 1938, Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, Jewish businesses, synagogues, and other property were destroyed in riots. The Holocaust, literally burned whole, had begun. Jews were moved into ghettos and forced to wear identifying yellow labels in the shape of the Star of David, a Jewish symbol. Anti-Semitism discrimination against Jews became the law in Germany. In 1942, Hitler and the Nazis came up with a plan Ghetto, a segregated area in the city, often occupied by one group with a shared racial, ethnic, or religious identity. Going back to what I was reading before I did that. In January 1942, Hitler and the Nazis came up with a plan they called the Final Solution. They planned to kill every Jew in a genocide, a killing of a race, ethnicity, or religious group of people, in concentration camps. The young and healthy were forced to work in camps until they died. Others were killed immediately in gas chambers. 6 million Jewish people were killed, along with about 5 million others who didn't fit in with Hitler's idea of a perfect Aryan society, including gay people, Romani people, disabled people, and anyone who opposed the Nazis. When Allied soldiers freed camp prisoners later, they were shocked to see the depth of Nazi brutality. Reading the list of people, now I see why that one guy who was on that Jubilee 1 versus 20 debate that pretty much declared, when it was said he was a Nazi supporter. Now I see why he supports them. Because they hate everything that people that hate the Nazis stand for. President Truman. In the election of 1944, Roosevelt became the only person to be elected president for the 4th time in a row, but his health was fading. On April 12, 1945, FDR died and Vice President Harry S. Truman took charge. The S wasn't short for his middle name. It stood for his two grandfathers, who both had S names. Apparently that wasn't such an odd thing to do with a middle initial in some places, and Harry was his full first name. Victory in Europe. After other air raids on German cities, the Allied forces launched a major attack on Dresden in February 1945. As Soviet troops entered Berlin, Hitler went into hiding. On April 30th, 1945, 2 days after Mussolini was killed by Italian partisans, Hitler committed suicide so he wouldn't have to face Germany's defeat. So basically, he could dish out, but he couldn't take it. On May 7th, after the Soviet army captured Berlin, the Germans surrendered to the Allied forces. May 8th was declared VE Day in honor of the victory in Europe. But World War II wasn't over yet. It was time to defeat Japan and end the war. Chapter 38, War in the Pacific. The final chapter of this part. Japanese victories. In December 1941, on the same day the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, they attacked American bases in Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines and took over Manila, the capital of the Philippines. They also invaded Thailand, Hong Kong, Malaya, now part of Malaysia, and Burma, Myanmar, today known as Myanmar. And here's the map that it shows right here. The map of their attacks that they would do. After months of conflict, American General Douglas MacArthur, his family, and some key aides were ordered to leave the Philippines to defend Australia. The Philippines surrendered to Japan. The troops still in the Bataan province of the Philippines were captured and forced on a brutal walk of over 60 miles to the Bataan Peninsula prison camps, where hundreds of Americans and thousands of Filipinos were killed. The event came to be known as the Bataan Death March, which it shows right there. Turning the tide. In April 1942, Americans launched air raids on Tokyo, which wasn't militarily significant, but did boost American morale. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, they blocked Japan from reaching Australia, helped by Admiral Chester Nimitz of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, who intercepted Japanese communications. Helped by Admiral Chester Nimitz of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, who intercepted Japanese communications. Code cracking also helped the Allies prepare for the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942. In a major American victory and turning point, the American Navy destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. The U.S. used Navajo code talkers, Navajo soldiers who communicated in codes based on the Navajo language. It was impossible for the Japanese or other outsiders to figure out the codes, and the code talkers made an invaluable contribution to the war. MacArthur and Nimitz adopted a strategy called island hopping to secure air bases in order to launch larger attacks on Japan. Capture small islands, use each as a base to capture other islands, hop closer to the Philippines and Japan. It was time-consuming but effective. From August 1942 to February 1943, the Marines fought to capture the island of Guadalcanal. In the October 1944 Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Allies destroyed almost the entire Japanese Navy. Allied forces liberated Manila in March 1945 and headed for Japan. And here's what they mean by island hopping. There it is right there. That whole page centered on showing the island hopping that they did. Reaching Japan. The Allied forces targeted 2 Japanese islands, Iwo Jima in February 1945 and Okinawa in April. In a desperate attempt to gain the upper hand, the Japanese used kamikazes, suicide pilots, to attack Allied ships, but the Allied forces still advanced. The A-bomb. Japan was unwilling to surrender, and the Allies considered a full-scale invasion. However, the U.S. had also conducted the first successful test of an atomic bomb on July 16, 1945. After 3 years of work on the Manhattan Project, led by scientist Robert J. Oppenheimer, FDR founded the Manhattan Project after Albert Einstein and other scientists had warned him that an atomic weapon was being developed by Germany. Even though he knew that a single atomic bomb could cost thousands of civilian lives, President Truman saw it as a justifiable way to end the war and to save countless Americans. Truman issued the Potsdam Declaration. If Japan did not surrender, the U.S. would inflict prompt and utter destruction. This seemed like just another threat, so Japan did not surrender. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. At least 75,000 people were killed in an instant. Japan remained firm. On August 9th, which will be coming up in, let's see, what's today, actually? So, they actually did happen over here, so, yeah, they already, so the 80th anniversary of both of them happened already. On August 9th, the U.S. dropped another atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, killing over 20,000 civilians. Many of those who survived the bombings later died from radiation and horrific burns or lived with severe health problems and disabilities. Now, let's talk about this for a second. So many people, I understand where people are coming from with this, but so many people have said that this was, the way that this action should not, like, it was just, uncalled for. That's what so many people, that's what some people believe. They think that this type of action should not have been done, at least, if not wasn't uncalled for. Um, but here's the thing, okay? While tragic, the bombings of, of, of Nagasaki and Hiroshima the deaths were in the hundred thousands. What do you think would have been the result of a full-scale invasion? Because remember, that was the alternative. That would have led to likely would have led to more deaths than those hundreds of thousands. Possibly in the millions. Possibly. So think about that for a second. While yet again, the bombings were tragic, and honestly, my heart does go out to the families of those who were impacted by what happened. But at that point in time, they felt like this was the better alternative than to send in possibly millions of soldiers to their deaths by way of full-scale invasion. So while it is tragic, while it is tragic, this was one of those cases of balancing the needs of the many, in this case the American soldiers, to the needs of to the lives of the many over the lives of the few. They knew both results were going to end up with people being killed, but they didn't want to take the action that would cause more deaths, which was the full-scale invasion option. The atomic bombs droppings, again, tragic that had to happen, but it had to happen to stop the war from continuing. And honestly, the second time, what happened on Hiroshima could have been avoided. Both bombings could have been avoided if Japan just up and surrendered. I know why they would think of them thinking it was a bluff. I can understand why they would think that. Because before this, who heard of an atomic bomb? Nobody. The only people that knew about it was the Americans, but because it was such a well-kept secret, nobody else knew about it at that point. At least very little, if any, knew about it at that point. So, yeah, but with that first bombing, that they would have just surrendered right then and there, knowing, okay, these guys do have this bomb, I should probably surrender, they still kept it. So in a way, it would not have happened had, had Japan surrendered from the very beginning. Or at least the very first bomb after it happened. If they would have surrendered, the second bombing wouldn't have happened, and if they were surrendered beforehand, before that, nobody would have died. So in a way, those who were in charge of announcing Japan's surrender, in their own way, they inadvertently caused the deaths of the hundreds of thousands, when you look at it in that way. The war ends. On August 15th, 1945, Japan surrendered. August 15th was Victory over Japan Day, or VJ Day, 3 months after VE Day. Some consider August 4th to be VJ Day because of the time differences between the US and Asia. On September 2nd, Japan signed the surrender documents. World War II was finally over. What makes a nuclear weapon nuclear? The power comes from reactions in the nuclei of atoms of radioactive elements which emit energy. When the particles collide, the result is so strong that a tiny amount of material can create a huge explosion. Atomic bombs, or A-bombs, get their power by splitting the nucleus. Even powerful hydrogen bombs, or H-bombs, invented in the 1950s, fuse multiple nuclei together. And that's the end of Chapter 2. Well, that's the end of this part of Unit 8, 7, and 8. Next time, I will just be reading Section 9 by itself, even though I could probably read Section 10 by itself, but if I do that, that would be the final part of me reading this book. I'll think about it. We'll see how long it takes for me to read this section. And if it takes me about an hour and a half to do it, then it takes me about at least an hour and a half to read through that part, then I'll probably wait for Unit 10 to be by itself. But either way, with that, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this reading live stream of me reading about U.S. history. Hope you guys enjoyed, and until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this is Forrest Walpole, signing off.